Okay, now we're going to go over a brief overview over selecting the proper mesh and frames. And I got a few samples here of some mesh and some frames. And first I'd like to go over the mesh. The mesh comes in two different colors, and depending from manufacturer to manufacturer, some of those colors can vary. For example, here I have two rows of mesh with me. One is white and one is yellow. But many manufacturers call the yellow gold in some cases, and it is a little bit darker. So you have to be very careful on how you select it. White mesh normally reflects light, where the yellow mesh or the gold mesh will absorb light. So the white mesh is used mainly for the lower detailed, lower resolution type printing, where the yellow mesh is used for the higher resolution, higher quality printing. Again, there is a difference also in the mesh counts, which the mesh counts consist of how many threads per inch. And that's how mesh is basically distinguished between one and the other. So depending on the type of printing that you're doing, you can average anywhere from a 60 mesh, 40 mesh, basically on white, till about 160 mesh for a lot of the athletic printing, specialty printing, more of the lower resolution type printing. Where on the yellow mesh, you basically would start off at around 200 threads per inch and go as high up as 380, depending on the type of printing you're doing. But in textile, probably the highest you'll go is 300. And that's how you basically choose your mesh. You want to be very selective on what you're printing to match with the mesh that you're going to be using. And you might want to check with your ink manufacturers on recommendations for their ink. But again, white reflects, yellow absorbs. Exposure times will be different, and we'll go over that also between the two. Once you've selected your mesh or the mesh count that you will be using to print, then we have to select the type of frame that we will be using. And I have some samples of some examples of frames and the most common frames that are used in screen printing. The most common and probably the most economical frame would be the wood frame. Okay, as you can see here, this is a very good, well-built wood frame. If you're going to use a wood frame, I recommend that you make sure it's a nice, sturdy, very hard, very stable frame. Personally, I do not like the wood frames. The wood frames can, with time, begin to want to warp and reduce the tension on the mesh, which we'll go over that here in a little bit. But this is one option here, is a wood frame. Your next option would be what they call the rigid metal frame or the aluminum frame. Okay, this one's nice because it's not heavy. It's very light, so your employees are not going to break their back trying to carry this from place to place. And the rigid aluminum frame, better known as an aluminum frame, is probably the most commonly used in the industry. No chances of this warping, and holds very good tension. This is actually one of my favorite ones as far as price and consistency. Next to the rigid frame, we have a roller frame. Okay, a roller frame or a retentionable frame. The retentionable frame is very useful for those who want to continue to use their mesh over and over again. If your frame loses tension, the advantage to this type of frame is that you can re-stretch your frame. Basically, by loosening the bolts on the sides there and having a wrench to roll it over will allow you to add more tension to the frame. This is also really good for consistency from frame to frame. If you need to be within a certain tension from frame to frame, especially when you're printing CMYK, you want to always maintain the same tension. So a retentionable frame is very useful in that scenario. But again, if cost or if money is an issue, the rigid aluminum, the rigid metal aluminum frame is going to be your best choice. Bigger shops, you'll see a lot more of the roller frames. But for entry level, the aluminum frame is more than enough. Okay, another thing I want to touch on the roller frames I almost left out here to mention is that the roller frames have strips basically locking the mesh in place. There's a company called Sherlock Systems, and they designed this pre-cut mesh with these inserts for the roller frames that are really nice. And I kind of just like to throw that in there because, again, I'm a big believer in that time is money. And if you're looking for an efficient way to do stuff, for me, even though they are a little bit more expensive, they're well worth the price and can save you a lot of time, and you'll have a lot more consistency at the time of putting the mesh into the roller frames. So it's just something to keep in mind, and something for me to touch on and let you know that these options are available for those of you that like to do things fast and save money on time. Really quick, another thing I would like to touch on in regards to mesh is something that's not very openly spoken of, and that is the different type of mesh diameters. Mesh diameters have become very important in screen printing now, and have always been very important in the graphic side of it, or the graphic end of it. But in textile printing now, it has become very popular topic. And the reason being is that I'm going to use an example of white ink. Everybody always talks about white ink and how do I get my white ink brighter. And you know, a lot of people, I always hear people complain about, here we go again, another new white ink. Like, quite honestly, I think a lot of this can be resolved with mesh diameters, or the thickness of the thread diameter in mesh. And reason being, if you look here on the board, I got two pictures. You know, not the best graphic designer in the world here, but we have a thin thread and a thick thread as example I'm trying to show here. And basically, if you see the open areas between the two, the thinner thread has a much wider open area. So what that means, it's going to release the ink a lot easier, a lot more consistently, a lot smoother. You might not have the thickness of the deposit, but you're going to have better coverage. And in order to have a good coverage on ink, you basically need this open area. Where in the thicker thread, what happens is the ink is going to want to get stuck on the walls of it. It's a lot, not necessarily, the opening is not necessarily narrow, but it's a lot higher, so it's going to take a lot longer to release the ink. So this is a very important topic. It's something to consider the next time you choose your mesh. And try one of the thinner threads. A lot of people are afraid of them because you know, they're a little bit more sensitive. They might rip a little bit easier. But quite honestly, in production, you might see your production speed up and your inks be more consistent and lay down a lot better and brighter.